Here in a few minutes, we'll be offering an invitation to each and every one of you. Each and every one of us has a choice to make. And that choice is to follow Jesus or not to follow Jesus. Just as we discussed this morning in our adult Bible class, we discussed about Pharaoh and how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Today I implore that each and every one of us have an open mind, an open heart, and learn from God's words. Turn with me over to the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. We're in Ruth chapter 4. You know, so far in the book of Ruth, we learn about Ruth's noble choice to where she will go with Naomi. And by doing that, she expressed her great love for her mother-in-law, willing to forego home and her religious background and adopt Israel's and the true God. Then in chapter 2, we see where she said, let me glean of the fields. And as being a widow herself, she's exercising her right to glean after the reapers during the harvest time. And what that did was, with her gleaning, she was providing substance. She was providing substance for herself and Naomi, her mother-in-law. Chapter 3, we see where she makes a request to take your maidservant, in which she was talking about herself. And she made that request to Boaz, who was a near relative. And in chapter 3, we also learned that was probably a very careful plan that was proposed by Naomi, her mother-in-law. And that brings us to chapter 4. And the other things that we've learned so far in the first 3 chapters is, the kind of man that Boaz was. And he had a very strong sense of priorities. He was a very hospitable man with great concern for duty and especially his reputation. And Boaz was a man that Naomi knew. And we see where he said there in Ruth chapter 3 in the verses 18, where she says, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day. That brings us to chapter 4, the final chapter in the book of Ruth. And in this chapter, we will learn how Boaz fulfills Ruth's maternal joy, in which results in the birth of a son. And that son became David's grandfather. And each and every one of us know who David is. David was in the lineage of Jesus. So let's look at chapter 4, Ruth. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, a close relative of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz says, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to propitiate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal, and Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech, and all that was Chilon's and Mahlon's from the hands of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord made the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Eltherath and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went in to her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, had bore him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, this is the son born to Naomi. And they call his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. And Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon. And Nahshon begot Salmon. And Salmon begot Boaz. And Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David. So here in chapter 4, we learn a few other things. about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. And in the beginning of this chapter, we see where Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And at that gate, in this time, they used the gate and as like a meeting place, a place where they would do trade, buy and sell things, and such, and things of the such. But we see where Boaz meets the closer relative at the gate. And he asked him to take a seat. And then we see where Boaz calls together 10 other elders of the city. And these elders frequently gathered at the gates. And we know that because in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 23, we are told that. And then these 10 elders would serve as witnesses on the transaction that was going to take place. And that transaction that was going to take place was regarding in Naomi's land. Because when Naomi came back, she ended up selling the land which belonged to her husband, in which he passed on while they were in Moab. In some translations, especially the New American Standard Bible, sort of indicates that she was about ready to sell the land. Because really that was within her right at that time, because she was poor. She had no substance or anything like that, and that's the reason why Ruth was gleaning the fields of Boaz. But it was within her right to sell that property. And under the old law, we read about that in Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 25. So during this transaction at the gate of the city, Boaz encourages the closest relative to buy this property off of Naomi. And if he doesn't, Boaz was going to do it. Because at that time it was very important to the children of Israel, the land. And the land was designed to stay within the family throughout time. And according to what we read here in chapter 4, when Boaz approached the closest relative, at first he was willing to purchase it off of Naomi. And then Boaz ends up pointing out the obligation that involved Ruth. Well, when I've studied that, I sort of envisioned that man, he's wanting to buy the property and all, and now there's a condition put on it that he's going to have to take care of Ruth. And I could see him getting up and running the opposite direction. But we're not told that. But at that point, he refused to redeem the land to keep it in the family. Because he refused to marry Ruth and to father her name into the next generation. And the closest relative stated that if he does do this, perhaps he was concerned about ruining his own inheritance. And if you think about that and you consider that, perhaps he knew the land would belong to Naomi's family going forward. So then he would be spending money for that land that would not actually belong to him. And then we see where Boaz steps in, who takes and purchases the land and the responsibility. So we see with the closest relative refusal of redemption, we see where Boaz redeems Naomi and Ruth. And redeems the transaction for Naomi's land. We read that in verses 7 through 8. And in that time, it was a custom to seal a deal by removing one of your sandals and giving it to the other. And if you read Ruth, that was a custom in former times. And it probably was not a custom at that time of Ruth. But we also have other customs that involves the removing of a sandal, and we can read that in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 7 through 10. And that's regarding to the refusal to marry the widow of one's brother. Also, it's an expression of shame for such a refusal to accept the responsibility. But yet in this particular case, shame does not appear to be the purpose, because he was worried about his own inheritance. But this transaction in Ruth chapter 4, verse 9, we see it was witnessed by the 10 elders and all the people that was there at the gate. And they witnessed, they saw that Boaz purchased all the land of Naomi's husbands and her 2 sons. And then we see where, starting in verse 10, where he makes arrangements for Ruth's hand in marriage. And the reason for that was because Mahlon, Ruth's husband, was dead. He passed away while still in Moab. And at that time, they done that to carry the family name on. And that was also witnessed and blessed with the town people and the elders. Because we see here in our text that where the people proclaimed themselves as being witnesses. They all seen it. And they blessed Ruth and Boaz. And we see that they refer to Rachel and Leah. That the Lord made Ruth just like Rachel and Leah. And then it goes on and states that Boaz would prosper and be famous in Bethlehem. And then also that they were blessed that their house would be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore Judah. We find that in Genesis chapter 46 and verse 12. So, with the transaction of the land being witnessed and their union as husband and wife, being blessed by people at the gate, we see where Boaz does marry Ruth. And the Lord, by the hand of the Lord, Ruth conceives. And she bore a son named Obed. So in a way, if you really look at it and you sit down and contemplate it, we see where the Lord himself accepted the union with Boaz and Ruth. Then in Ruth chapter 4, starting in verse 14 and 15, we see that they praised and prayers were offered by the women, where they said, "Praise to the Lord for his kindness to Naomi through her daughter-in-law." Then they prayed that the child would be a restorer, a nourisher to Naomi in her old age. And then one of the neighbor women actually named the child Obed. And we go on and see there in verse 17, and we are told that he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Then we see the genealogy of Perez in the last couple verses, where Perez, the son of Judah, bore Hezron. Hezron bore Ram, Amminadab. Then it went to Nashon and Salmon and Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David. So at the beginning of us looking through the book of Ruth, we noted that the book of Ruth serves two different purposes. Number one, to illustrate how God rewards those who makes wise spiritual choices and shows steadfastness in their loyalty to what they believe. And also to explain how Ruth, being a Moabitess, came to be the ancestor of David and ultimately to Jesus. But the book also reveals a few other examples of good character. Look at the nobility of the character in Ruth herself, who proved to be better to Naomi than if she had 7 sons. and the nobility of Boaz as an employer and believer in God's promises and commands. But I want you to remember this one fact about Ruth. We need to remember Ruth and Boaz came out of a very dark period in Israel's history. It was during the time of the Judges. And in Judges 21 verse 25, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So may the example of their character encourage us to do what is right when we live among people whom seem to be little different than those in the days of the Judges. So this afternoon, I want you to ask yourself, is your life like Ruth and Boaz? Are you willing to follow Jesus and do what he asks? So this afternoon, if anyone has any needs, why don't you come as we stand and we sing the song of invitation?